Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is Friday, March 21st, 2025. Yesterday we did a show with the New York Times writer Clay Risen on Joe McCarthy, Donald Trump, and the paranoid style of American history. He has a major new book out, Red Scare, Blacklists McCarthyism and the Making of Modern America. He reminded us that there were many, many victims of McCarthyism, some more surprising than others. Indeed, one man who was a victim, who I didn't even know was a victim of McCarthyism, was the great German writer and German emigre to America, Thomas Mann, in the 1950s. He was imagined by the paranoid McCarthyists as a suspected communist. And of course, Mann is all too familiar with the rise of fascism in Europe. He wrote a book in 1938 called The Coming Victory of Democracy. And this was a book that he actually toured the United States talking about when he emigrated to the United States in the 1930s. The story of this is revived, and it's an important story, by my guest today, Morten Høj Jensen, who has the cover story of this issue of Liberties, Mannhood, the Coming Revival of Democracy. Morten Høj Jensen is based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and he's joining us today. Morten, congratulations on the book. I know you have an upcoming book on Mann coming out, The Master of Contradictions, Thomas Mann and the Making of the Magic Mountain, which will be out in the fall. Maybe we'll get you back on the show to talk about that. But remind us of Mann's life in the United States. What actually happened to him? Firstly, in the 1930s, when he came as an emigre, and then when he was actually persecuted by the McCarthyists.
Yeah, it's an interesting trajectory that Thomas Mann's life in America aligns with this political trajectory, because when he first comes to the United States, he makes his first visit in 1934, and then visits quite frequently up until 1938, when he and his wife and their youngest children finally decide to emigrate to America, because they have begun to fear that even Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, is not far away enough from the menace of Nazi Germany. And when he comes to the United States for the first time, he's a Nobel Prize winner. His books were sold very, very well in America. They had started being translated in the early 1920s, thanks to Alfred A. Knopf and Mann's very dedicated translator Helen Tracy Lowe Porter. And Mann was very influential, was very well connected, and one person that helped sort of introduce him to audiences in America was Agnes Meyer, who is the wife of the owner of the Washington Post, Eugene Meyer. And she's sort of the person in the background, making connections, helping Mann to get his post at Princeton in 1938. And around this time, again, thanks to his connections, Mann is a guest at the White House on a few occasions, and like many other emigre writers, was very kind of smitten with President FDR. Roosevelt.
Who could be a very charming man when he wanted to be, of course.
Absolutely.
And I imagine he was as impressed in some ways with Mann as Mann was with him.
The anecdotes go that he didn't really, he wasn't very impressed with Mann, apparently. That's what I've read and heard. Although I haven't really.
I don't know how literary FDR was. I mean,
I don't actually either. But it is interesting because
probably means that he wasn't very literary, since we don't know. He certainly was no Kennedy, was he? JFK,
no,
in terms of his interest in literature.
Right.
So I want to get to the piece in a second in terms of the 1930s. But what happened then that Mann himself became one of the victims of the Red Scare in the 1950s? It's really astonishing.
It is. And what happens is that he sort of falls in love with the America of the New Deal. And he sees the New Deal and FDR's broadly conceived politics as the right way to meet the threat of fascism, sort of head on with a very militant kind of humanism. And he becomes an American citizen in 1944, I think. I mean, it's not so much what the question isn't what really happens to Thomas Mann, but rather what happens to the country, because the America that welcomes him in the 30s and awards him citizenship in the 40s is a completely different place by the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, and it's I'm not sure if you've seen Risen's new book. It's well worth reading. But he reminds us that it wasn't just a Republican witch hunt. In fact, in many ways, it was started by Harry Truman and the Democrats. So this was a bipartisan effort, so to speak, to root out communists and be paranoid about anyone. I mean, the idea that Mann was an admirer of the New Deal made him, in my mind at least, like most Americans. I mean, given that FDR had been elected 4 times, the most popular American president perhaps in history, there's nothing radical about that.
No, but what the term that was applied to Mann, a sort of reprehensible euphemism, was premature anti-fascist, which by the standards of McCarthyist America, he had been a little too early in his warnings against fascism.
There's some Freudian connotations there in terms of premature anti-fascism.
Yes. But truly, by the standards of McCarthyist America, this made you anyone's suspect. If you had been a little too quick on the trigger to start warning against fascism, then it must mean that you were somehow either a communist or had sympathies with Soviet.
So in the minds of that paranoid time, this idea of premature anti-fascism, was it that perhaps Mann was an agent of the Soviet Union, or some sort of undercover communist intent on destroying the American way?
I think that's probably what they feared, or what they believed, or perhaps that he was connected to people who were intent on, in their eyes, destroying American society. And he certainly was connected to communist agents in one way or another, whether or not he was aware of it, because he was so involved in anti-fascist activities in the 30s and early 40s. And some of those organizations were later on revealed to have had connections with Soviet agents and so on. But of course, Mann himself had nothing to do with that.
And you've got this book coming out. I mean, you know a billion times more about Mann than I do. But when I think of Mann's politics, when I think of his great works, whether it's The Magic Mountain or Buddenbrooks, he was anything but a radical. I mean, he was a conservative. I mean, his politics seems to me to be a form of kind of apolitical conservative centrism, at least until perhaps the rise of the Nazis. But he was anything but a leftist, wasn't he?
Yes, I don't think it would be fair to describe him as a leftist. I mean, his politics are sort of very hard to pin down at any given moment because they change so much, and that's perhaps is in the nature of someone who is fundamentally kind of apolitical. But you're right; he certainly began and was for most of his life some form of conservative, at least in the sense of being very allergic to radical changes. And anything like revolutionary politics.
And it comes to mind Max Weber's famous speech. I think it was in 1919 about distinguishing politics and art, and the Sermon on the Mount attitude to the world. I mean, wasn't Mann's suspicion of politics that it was against art, and that the sermonizing of the political class, especially the radical political class, undermined the great artists, the Thomas Mann, the Mahlers of the world?
I don't know if he felt that it undermined, but certainly that it was. He believed at that time that it was
kind of inferior, and I use this term carefully, an inferior calling, perhaps.
Yes.
The great artists, whether it was Mann or Mahler or whoever, and especially given the tradition of the great artist, thinker, painter, composer in the German tradition, the politics was somehow beneath them.
Yes. And this was, in that sense, Mann was completely typical of his background and his time, because prior to the First World War, most German writers were quite uninterested in the political realm. It was almost a point of pride for them to be separate, to stand very separate from any kind of involvement with politics and with the state apparatus, which they sort of looked down upon as beneath the lofty realms of art.
Yeah, and as the old joke goes, they may not have been interested in politics, but politics became very interested in them.
Exactly. And I think that very quote is so applicable to Mann, because politics was very interested in Thomas Mann. And he's very sort of conservative and nationalistic throughout the First World War. But then he's from that moment on, after the war, he is in the thick of it, so to speak, for the rest of his life, because he's in Munich at the time. He's in Munich in the early 1920s when Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists are beginning to manifest themselves as a force in German politics, when they're brawling in the beer halls and so on. He experiences the 1918-1919 Bavarian Social Revolution, and that's when his politics begin to shift in some way, and he recognizes the threat from the extreme right in Germany.
Yeah, it's interesting that I mentioned that Weber speech. I think he gave it in Munich in 19.
He gave it in Munich in
I was
January or February 1919.
Yeah, last year I was at that Nazi museum in Munich, which is quite an experience. Certainly, as the Germans do museums well, they do that one particularly well. Mm-hmm. What was then Mann's attitude to Weimar, and certainly the politics of Weimar? Did he have a natural party? I mean, what was his attitude towards the left, both the Social Democrats and the Communists in the 1920s?
By the early 20s, he resigns himself to the Weimar democracy in his own peculiar ways. He's never sort of a natural fit, really, for the left, but because he saw and recognized the threat to Germany coming from the far right, and he recognizes something in democracy that he sympathizes with, and he reads the poetry and the writings of Walt Whitman in the early 1920s, and in his own peculiar way, he comes to, by way of Whitman, by way of Tolstoy, by way of Goethe, he begins to sort of rethink his attitude towards democracy, um, and and he never, even when he was at his most conservative, it was never because he was sympathetic towards the Kaiser or the German Empire. He had nothing but sort of scorn for that kind of conservatism. It was a much more cultural conservatism that was concerned with German spiritual values. But his turn towards democracy in the early 1920s happens by way of the writing of his novel, The Magic Mountain. And in a way, it's a kind of fulfillment or further development of what he conceives of as a very conservative argument that he makes in his long book, Reflections of a Non-Political Man, which is that art has to encompass both what is good and what is evil in humankind. And he had previously thought that writers who were politically involved didn't see human nature in its full in its fullness, encompassing everything that is contradictory and dark and unreasonable in humankind. But he recognized, I think, that you can think one thing when you're sitting down and writing your fiction, and quite another if you're going to the voting booth.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that book. It's probably one I should be. Did he have a natural party then in Weimar, the liberals? I mean, what was his attitude to people like Rathenauer? I mean, were there politicians who he sympathized with?
Yeah, he was very shocked and horrified by the assassination of Walter Rathenau. That was
who was the sort of the liberal beacon, a liberal with a small L, the classic liberal, right?
Yeah, and also I think for Mann represented someone who had truly dedicated himself to the service of the nation, both as an industrialist, as a writer, and certainly as a statesman. But Mann was so horrified by the assassination in 1922 of Rathenau that he dedicated a speech that he was going to give on the 60th birthday of the, at the time, very great and august German writer Gerhard Hauptmann. And in that speech, Thomas Mann makes his very sort of fulsome and passionate defense of democracy. And he ends that speech with the words, "Long live the Republic."
It's hard to sometimes imagine this man from the clouds, from the heavens, being passionate. He always seems so godlike, I guess, in his own way, certainly in his writing. So what was his interpretation, Morten, of why Weimar collapsed? Firstly, why Weimar collapsed, and secondly, the rise of Nazism. Did he have original thoughts on this? I mean, there were so many interpretations, of course, but what was the Mannian interpretation of all this, of the late 20s and then the early 30s?
It sort of depends on which Thomas Mann you ask, because he gave different answers depending on what time during the Nazi era it was, and what his circumstances were and his own understanding of it, because he spends the rest of his life trying to sort of figure out what went wrong with Germany. His last great novel, Dr. Faustus, is sort of his final artistic statement on what happens to Germany his entire life. I mean, he's born 4 years after the unification of Germany, and he dies a few years before the Berlin Wall is built. So he lives through a sort of constant series of disappearing Germanys. I mean, in sort of political terms, I think it's fair to say he didn't have particularly original thoughts or political analyses. He was always very much the artist. And that's why it can be kind of difficult to talk about his politics, because they are very much an artist's approach to politics, and a constant work in progress. But he's very clear in his condemnation of the Nazis throughout the 1920s. And there are various instances. For instance, in 1930, he gives a speech on Goethe, at which Nazi rabble-rousers interrupt him. The burnt copies of Buddenbrooks were thrown into his garden. So he's a very clear target of the Nazi scorn for much of the 20s. But I think he spends the rest of his life and career as a writer trying to understand what exactly it was about Germany that went wrong. And the reason it's so interesting what Thomas Mann thought is because he puts himself on the docket. He looks into himself to try to answer the question of what went wrong, because he recognizes so many drifts, so many currents, both intellectual and artistic and cultural, in modern Germany in himself. And it's this this intense self-criticism that I think makes his writings about what goes on at the time so worthy of our interest. Yeah, I don't think he had any real original thoughts about the collapse of the Weimar Republic. I think he wasn't an especially astute political analyst. I think it's fair to say he didn't really have a natural party, and his politics are always very much the politics of an artist, and filled with sort of contradictions and paradoxes, and so they can be hard to describe exactly. But he remained a very vocal critic of the Nazis throughout the 1920s and into the 30s, and occasionally ran afoul of Nazi stormtroopers and rabble-rousers.
Morten, did he have regrets? Today, there are many writers, artists who are trying to figure out how to respond to Trump and MAGA. May or may not be a repeat of history. Who knows? We'll see. But when Mann looked back at the 20s and early 30s, given that he was an incredibly influential figure both in and out of Germany, did he have regrets about not being perhaps more outspoken?
I think his regrets went back further to his wartime patriotism during the First World War, because, well, part of what makes Thomas Mann's writings about what happens to Germany in the 30s and 40s so fascinating is that he was very self-incriminating. He always feared that he had helped put words into the mouths or ideas into the mouths of the Nazis by writing some of the articles that he wrote during the First World War. And what makes his writings about these issues so fascinating is that he's constantly blaming himself, or not blaming himself, but looking into himself for answers to the question of why Germany marched into the arms of National Socialism. And he writes this extraordinary essay in 1938 called Brother Hitler, in which he describes Hitler as a kind of a brother, a very unfortunate and malicious brother, but a brother nevertheless, because he recognizes Hitler as at one point a fellow artist, and he recognized so many of these artistic ambitions
Interesting.
in Hitler that he had struggled with himself as a younger man. And in a much later essay called Germany and the Germans, which is one of the first public reckonings with the Second World War from a German after the Second World War, he traces the origins of Nazism all the way back to Martin Luther. And he says in that speech that there are not two Germanys, one good and one bad. There is only one Germany. And he says, I know because they are both within me. And so that's what makes it so fascinating, is that he never lets himself off the hook when trying to answer and wrestle with some of these questions.
In the 30s, did Mann imagine the terrible crimes that the Nazis would commit? Was he someone who understood that once they came to power, war and mass murder was inevitable? Or did he always give his brother Hitler, as you say, the benefit of the doubt, as some people give Trump, perhaps even myself, that, well, this guy's a bit of a clown, a charlatan, but in the end he'll just go away and be replaced by somebody else?
I think once Hitler came to power, I don't think Mann had many illusions about him or what he was capable of. Certainly up until Hitler comes to power, there were very few who imagined that anything of the magnitude that did happen would happen. And that was true of all writers in Weimar Germany. Nobody really took him seriously as a potential political historical figure. But once he had come to power, the news that reached Mann in southern France or in Switzerland throughout the next many years were just constantly bad news. And it was news of censorship, of mass arrests, friends or literary acquaintances that were killed or committed suicide or were arrested. And he's very stung by England and France's refusal to intervene on the side of Spain in the Spanish Civil War, or to do anything about Czechoslovakia. And he becomes more and more, I think, pessimistic. And I don't think he had any illusions that things wouldn't be as bad as they were. He probably
seems as if
hopes, but
cultural pessimism might come naturally to him.
Yes.
He was married to a woman from a Jewish family. There were, of course, many intellectuals, publishers, writers, German Jewish artists, writers, who he must have been familiar with and close to. Did he take strong positions in terms of defending Germany's Jews?
He did eventually, yes. I mean, he was, very typical of his background and class. Not in any way incapable of anti-Semitic remarks or anti-Jewish remarks from time to time earlier in his life, even when he was married to a woman from a very prominent a Jewish family in Munich. But he's also quite clear in the early 20s when anti-Semitic protests break out, when the violence breaks out. He's I think from then on takes quite brave stands. And in this lecture, The Coming Victory of Democracy, which is delivered in 1938, he already then he mentions the existence of concentration camps within Germany to which Jews are being taken.
So let's get to that. This is, of course, your piece, Mannhood, The Coming Revival of Democracy, or The Coming Victory of Democracy, that was the name of the book. Mm-hmm. What was it? What did he argue? And was it an influential tour of the United States?
It was quite influential. I think he traveled to, was it 8 or 9 initial cities, but he gave similar lectures in years to come. I think he appeared as many as 140 times in the late 30s and early 40s in America, all across the country. So the lecture, he was contacted by a literary agent in New York called Harold Peet, who gave him a very lucrative offer. I forget the exact number, but a very lucrative offer if he would speak, or if he would engage in a transcontinental lecture tour, and if he would talk about democracy. And Mann was happy to do so at the time. He was accompanied on the trip by his wife, and also by his oldest daughter, Erica, who was very close to him at this time, and also herself lectured across America in the late 30s and early 40s. It's in terms of the text itself, as with all Thomas Mann's political writings, very strange at times, because at the end of the lecture, you can tell that he's sort of trying to calm his audiences who might be suspecting him of harboring radical or communist sympathies, by telling him that he is a conservative and he speaks as a conservative, and yet he has spent the entire lecture advancing a political definition of democracy that can only be described as social democratic, and at times he even speaks,
or New Dealish. I mean, not.
Yeah, New Dealish. But even with potential, he sort of leaves the door open to friendliness towards the Soviet Union, and he very much plays down the threat that communism supposedly posed.
Did he, in terms of the speech and in terms of the book and the tour, was he saying it could happen here? Was he warning Americans that unless they protected and cherished their institutions, their legal system, their political system, their voting system, that what happened in Germany could easily happen in the United States?
Absolutely. He says that, he recognizes early on in the lecture, he starts to say that, it's not easy to speak on the coming victory of democracy at a time of, triumphant fascism all over the world. And he says that one even feels here in America that democracy is not as assured a possession as it should be. And this is something that he will continue to talk about the longer he's in the United States, because he begins to see the McCarthyist currents in America. He encounters some of that, and he begins to warn, and he begins to actually think that that fascism is very possible in America. And indeed, it's one of the reasons he ends up leaving when he does in the late 40s. I think he leaves in 1948 or 49, because the political climate, he sees echoes of what he had seen in Germany in the late 20s and early 30s.
You wrote another interesting piece for Liberties in January about a lunch he had with the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig in 1939, in which they talk about the responsibility of the artist in these times. Did he change his mind on whether or not the artist should be more political in these times of great crisis for democracy?
Certainly, compared to his views at the outbreak of the First World War, where he saw any kind of political advocacy on part of writers as the sort of thing that writers should not be engaging in, as antithetical to art and to the artist's independence. Certainly, he changes his view of that throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And it's a question he constantly wrestles with, because he recognizes that the artist as a figure is an unreliable political ally, so to speak, in the sense that art is what I think Iris Murdoch called close play with dangerous forces. But I think sorry.
Well, but there were artists who were much more
there were artists who
explicit. I mean, Picasso, of course, comes to mind. Other writers and poets, Orwell, of course.
True. And Mann spends most of the 30s and the Second World War finishing his a book that seems very remote from the concerns of the day, which are his 4 massive Joseph novels. But at the same time, he is very involved in practically every single anti-fascist league in America at the time. He has a post at the Library of Congress where he speaks about what's going on in Germany. He and his wife provided shelter and financial help to exiles and other emigre writers who came their way. And of course, in Dr. Faustus, which I mentioned earlier, his last big novel is a very explicit, I think, engagement with the problem of modern Germany from the late 19th century up until the outbreak of the Second World War.
Finally, in terms of that perhaps Faustian bargain, what does the story of Mann's life, of his resistance, of his writing teach us about today? You wrote an interesting piece recently about Christopher Hitchens, the great polemicist who unfortunately is no longer around. There don't seem to be that many Hitchens around these days to really confront, particularly in the United States, Trump and the MAGA movement. There are some, I guess, in some ways. But what does the example of Mann teach aspiring Hitchens, people who want to expose, maybe as artists or just as political writers, what's actually happening in America today? The closing of universities, the violent treatment of immigrants, the persecution of the trans community. There are lots of eerie comparisons with what happened in the 1930s, maybe not exact, but sufficiently eerie to make us concerned. What does Mann teach us? Because he is, in his own way, both in his writing and in terms of his life, he is ultimately a teacher, isn't he, Mort?
Yes, he is someone who believed very much in the idea of education, pedagogy, and built up himself as having a kind of teacher role, a teacher of humanity. It's hard, I think, to imagine 2 writers less alike than Thomas Mann and Christopher Hitchens, because Thomas Mann was someone who, the reason that he deserves our attention beyond his of course his fictional achievements is what I said earlier, which is that he constantly used himself and looked into himself for a way of engaging with his surroundings. So he never stopped blaming himself for having potentially held opinions that at the time the Nazis might have shared. Whereas someone like Christopher Hitchens, I think, didn't spend a lot of time engaged in this kind of deep self-examinations. I mean, his whole life was sort of very external.
Although Hitchens is perhaps most interesting in his autobiography when he writes about discovering his mother being Jewish. So there is an element of interiority about Hitchens.
Yes. I think, with what's going on today, that there is a kind of a bastardized version of Hitchens's contrarianism that you see on the right, and that has cheered Trumpism because they regard it as, apostasy from the liberal consensus or from the mainstream liberal media. I think some of those people see themselves as heirs of Hitchens, but I would, of course, argue that they are anything but. What Mann can teach us is hard to say. I mean, I think he extraordinarily honest with himself when he looked into
brutally honest, I think.
Perhaps
a little too honest.
Perhaps, yeah. And I mean, his whole life, all of his writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is one big confession.
Yeah, one conversation with himself.
One very long and very arduous and painful and tormented conversation with himself. And in many ways, I think someone like Thomas Mann is just too remote from most people.
Certainly now, even at the time. Is there a great man of literature equivalent in some ways to Mann, either in Germany or United States? I think of Philip Roth, of course, who wrote a book about the 1930s. There's Günter Grass, of course, in Germany, who's also a controversial figure. Are we living in a post-Great Man age where Thomas Mann or Thomas Mann types simply cannot exist, even in Russia? I mean, Solzhenitsyn's gone.
It's possible. I mean, it certainly is hard to name sort of one large looming figure. But I don't think that means that we don't have tons of very.
Who do you look? Who should we look to for moral or intellectual guidance here? Hitchens isn't around. Thomas Mann isn't around.
Well, I think it's
so
not.
DiMaggio is no longer around.
I think that we shouldn't necessarily have to turn to one particular figure or individual for answers or for salvation.
Maybe it should be Leon at Liberties. He's our man of wisdom. Finally, Morten, we're taking it for granted, of course, that everyone's read Mann, which they haven't. You've mentioned Dr. Faustus, which is his last book. I mean, the three most famous books, of course, are his first book, Buddenbrooks, Death in Venice, a magical book and a very short, readable book. And then, of course, The Magic Mountain. You've got a book about the Magic Mountain coming out. For people who aren't familiar with the work of Mann, where would you begin?
I think Death in Venice, because it's fairly short, is a useful place to begin. But I would also say Buddenbrooks, even though it's a longer novel, because it's a much more straightforward novel than any of his
1901 novel, of course, before the First World War.
The most unlikely novel ever written by a 25-year-old. It's very straightforward. It has the kind of grandeur of the great 19th century novels, and again, it is a more straightforward novel than anything he wrote, any of his subsequently longer novels. But Death in Venice, the other early short story, Tonio Kröger, which is from 1903, is a kind of Mann's version of Portrait of the Artist as a young man.
It's ironic that he was he's not really much of a cinematic writer, but of course Death in Venice now is more famous in some ways as a movie than as a book. But of course he was
indeed
the most literary of writers. A wonderful conversation with Morten Høj Jensen, the author of Mannhood, with two N's, of course, The Coming Revival of Democracy. An excellent and important essay in this issue of Liberties about Thomas Mann's Victory of Democracy tour in 1938, and perhaps so relevant today. Thank you so much, Morten. Keep well in Copenhagen, and we look forward to your new book on Mann, The Master of Contradictions, Thomas Mann and the Making of the Magic Mountain. You'll have to come back on the show in the fall when it comes out. Thank you so much.
It will be my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
He's an expert.